Welcome back, amazing people. Your support means the world. Let's dive in and make this one unforgettable. Here's my full take. For years, Europe has been portrayed as slow to act, hesitant to decide, and too cautious to think strategically. That stereotype has been repeated in countless commentaries and news cycles. Yet, over the past year, Europe has displayed a quiet shrewdness that directly contradicts those assumptions. Confronted with an unpredictable United States under the leadership of President Trump, Europe has neither lashed out impulsively nor capitulated to pressure. Instead, it has adapted, and it has adapted with remarkable discipline. When Trump returned to office and introduced some of the country's highest tariffs in nearly a century, the common expectation was that Europe would respond aggressively, that a transatlantic trade war would be inevitable. Analysts warned that such a confrontation would disrupt supply chains, inflate prices globally, and weaken already fragile economic growth. But Europe resisted the temptation to retaliate immediately. By absorbing the pressure, avoiding escalation, and buying time, the continent prevented what could have been a catastrophic downward spiral in global markets. This strategy of measured restraint has not gone unnoticed. It signals a shift from reactionary policies to deliberate long-term planning, and it demonstrates that Europe is increasingly capable of defending its own interests independently without relying solely on the predictability of the United States. Then last week, Europe moved decisively after more than 2 decades of stalled negotiations. The European Union approved a sweeping trade agreement with Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. If ratified, this deal will create one of the world's largest free trade zones by population, encompassing more than 700 million people. This is not just a symbolic gesture. It represents a serious structural effort to diversify Europe's economic dependencies. What's particularly striking is that this is not an isolated maneuver aimed solely at Latin America. Brussels and Beijing in recent weeks have also signaled that they have resolved a series of trade tensions that threaten to escalate into broader conflicts over electric vehicle subsidies and market access. Europe is cautious with China, aware of the industrial policies and political system that Beijing maintains. Yet pragmatically, the EU now regards China as a necessary partner. Simultaneously, Europe is accelerating its engagement with Southeast Asia, having already established trade agreements with Singapore and Vietnam, concluded negotiations with Indonesia, and continuing discussions across the region. This area is already Europe's third largest trading partner outside its own borders. This strategic instinct to diversify is not confined to Europe. Consider Canada. For decades, Ottawa made a clear bet that its future prosperity was intertwined with ever-deepening integration with the United States, economically, diplomatically, and politically. More than 75% of Canadian goods exports flowed south in 2024, making it one of the most successful integration stories of the post-Cold War era. But that trust is now fractured. Trump's tariffs, threats to renegotiate trade agreements, and his unusual rhetoric, including statements about annexing territory from neighboring countries, have forced Canada to rethink its strategy. Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, is openly pursuing distance from Washington. His Foreign Minister, Anita Anand, recently stated in Beijing that it is imperative to diversify trading partners and grow non-U.S. trade by at least 60% over the next decade. This is not mere hedging. This is a strategic reversal. Observing China's trade data reinforces this point. The world is not de-risking from Beijing, but from Washington. Despite reduced exports to the U.S., China's overall trade continues to grow. Its trade surplus surged to nearly $1.2 trillion in 2025 as exports to Latin America, Africa, Europe, and much of Asia expanded rapidly. U.S. tariffs, rather than isolating China, encourage countries worldwide to continue trading with Beijing. Public opinion reflects this transformation. A major European Council on Foreign Relations poll finds that in key emerging powers such as India, Brazil, and South Africa, the proportion of respondents favoring alignment with a U.S.-led bloc over a Chinese-led one has dropped between 15 and 19 percentage points in just 2 years. In Europe, only 16% of respondents now see America as an ally. While most still consider the U.S. a key partner, views of China are increasingly pragmatic rather than favorable. Singapore's former Foreign Minister George Yeo recently summarized the situation by stating that Trump's policies are fast-forwarding the world into a multipolar future. The stakes here are immense. It is not simply a question of America's image abroad. It is a matter of long-term U.S. influence and power. China is deliberately constructing one of the most resilient economic ecosystems in modern history, dominating critical mineral processing, achieving scale in batteries and electric vehicles, and diversifying export markets to withstand sanctions, shocks, and tariffs. The only credible U.S. response is not tariffs, which over the past year have coincided with declining manufacturing employment. Instead, the United States needs to build its own resilient ecosystem, leveraging its extraordinary advantages, a vast network of allies and partners controlling advanced technology, capital, skilled labor, and consumer markets. In theory, this coalition could source critical materials from trusted countries, spread manufacturing across allies, share research, and maintain open, predictable markets. In practice, however, the U.S. has squandered much of this advantage by treating allies as transactional customers, weaponizing tariffs, and transforming long-standing commitments into leverage points. Washington has encouraged other nations to hedge against it. The U.S. is no longer setting the global trend. It is retreating into protectionism and nationalism while the world searches for greater trade, cooperation, and stability elsewhere. For decades, the global order was built on an American foundation. Trade was routed through U.S.-designed institutions. Security relied on U.S. guarantees. Crises were managed, for better or worse, by Washington. Policy agendas were largely shaped in America. That platform still exists, but the world is no longer constructing its future on it. It is building around it. President Trump recently announced a new set of tariffs, raising rates to 25% on imports from close allies, including the UK, France, and Germany. This is part of his increasingly aggressive effort to pressure Denmark into ceding Greenland, a semi-autonomous territory. In response, former U.S. officials and policy analysts, including Richard Haass of the Council on Foreign Relations and others who have served in top advisory roles, have highlighted the potential transatlantic crisis this represents. For the first time in decades, a NATO member is essentially threatening to annex territory from another NATO member, raising questions about alliance cohesion and credibility. Many experts argue that Trump's approach risks long-term damage to NATO itself. The more aggressive tactics, tariff threats, coercive negotiations, and public declarations reinforce European perceptions that the United States is unreliable as a partner. Even if a short-term agreement is reached, the credibility and trust deficits have already emerged. Europeans are increasingly treating the U.S. as a partner to work around, or in the worst cases, as an actor to work against strategically. What options remain for Europe? Analysts suggest a coordinated response is necessary. This includes potentially using reciprocal tariffs strategically, especially on sectors such as technology, as a form of pressure. Europe's approach so far, measured restraint, diversification of trade agreements, and engagement with global partners, should continue, but experts argue that at some point, decisive action is required to prevent further unilateral pressures. The strategic lesson here is clear. The United States cannot assume that its past dominance guarantees compliance or deference. Global partners and competitors are adapting, diversifying, and consolidating influence in ways that may leave the U.S. isolated if it does not recalibrate its approach. This moment demonstrates a fundamental shift in global geopolitics. The world is no longer unipolar, relying on U.S. hegemony. Multipolarity is emerging as nations, including Canada, European Union members, China, and Southeast Asian countries, seek resilience, diversification, and strategic autonomy. Trump's actions, whether through tariffs, threats to Greenland, or unpredictable foreign policy declarations, have accelerated this trend rather than achieving his intended leverage. For the United States to maintain influence, it must recognize the reality of this new global architecture and build coalitions and economic ecosystems that are forward-looking, collaborative, and resilient. The era of unilateral influence is ending. What remains is the capacity to engage strategically with multiple actors who are now independently shaping the global economy and geopolitical landscape. The world is no longer waiting for the U.S. to dictate the rules. It is writing its own, and those nations that adapt fastest will define the new balance of power. In conclusion, Trump's aggressive and transactional approach to global diplomacy has highlighted weaknesses in traditional U.S. influence, but it has also revealed a broader systemic shift. Europe, Canada, China, and Southeast Asian nations are demonstrating that strategic patience, diversification, and coalition building are far more effective than confrontation and coercion. The U.S. can still act to maintain relevance and authority, but it must abandon outdated assumptions, leverage its unique advantages more effectively, and engage with partners as equals rather than subjects of transactional power. The narrative is now clear. The world is quietly countering Trump's actions, reshaping the global order, and positioning itself for a more stable, multipolar future. America's challenge is no longer simply about asserting dominance. It is about learning to compete in a rapidly evolving, interdependent, and resilient global system.
The stakes are enormous, and the consequences will shape the next decade of U.S. foreign policy and global economic dynamics. This is the context in which every tariff, every negotiation, and every statement must be understood. And for those watching, it is a rare opportunity to see how careful, calculated, and ultimately effective diplomacy can unfold quietly behind the scenes, even when headline-grabbing chaos dominates the news cycle. The strategic lesson, patience, coalition building, and forward-thinking trade and diplomacy are the tools that the world is now wielding against an impulsive and unpredictable United States. Observers, policymakers, and citizens alike should pay close attention because these developments will define the rules of engagement for years to come.